Assalamualaikum. Greetings everyone. This is GTK317 Emergency Response and Planning. Topic: Disaster Management in Malaysia. Subtopic: Understanding Disaster. My name is Dr. Khairilmizal Samsudin. You also know me as Dr. Mizal. My email and my contact detail as in the slides. In this session, the learning outcome will be to understand the concept of disaster, and secondly, to differentiate different types of disaster event. Most people in the world are religious. Local religious institutions are key providers of education, health services, emergency relief, and general development. Even in our previous session, I did share with you how the religious community assists in helping the communities during disaster. In Islam, Surah Al-Yusuf, ayat 46, 47 and 48 did share on the importance of preparedness in disaster. There are so many definitions on disaster. Some stated that disaster are classified as natural and man-made disaster. Others stated that disaster is an occurrence that has resulted in property damage, death, injuries to community. Some also stated that disaster is a non-routine event in which societies or their largest subsystem are socially disrupted and physically harmed. Complicated, isn't it? But some people define disaster based on numbers, like CRAD 2009 defined disaster as 10 or more people reported killed or 100 people reported affected. Even the UNEP or the APEL in 2009 stated that disaster has 25 or more fatalities, 125 more injuries, 10,000 people evacuated, or 10,000 more deprived of water, or USD $10 million in damage. If we base on this value, especially the 10 million US dollar in damage, then most possibly Malaysia never have disaster. Let me share with you a simple experiment. Let's just say while driving in Putrajaya, me, Mizal, got into an accident with another car. Is it a disaster? I give you 10 seconds to think about it. It's not a disaster, right? Because accident is normal. People have accidents nearly every day in Kuala Lumpur. But for me, it might be a disaster. Why? Because now I don't have a car. I need to make a police report. I need to claim the insurance. I cannot send my wife to work. I cannot go to work. I cannot buy necessities because I don't have a car. So it's a disaster to me. Okay, second question. While Mizal sustained a minor injury, the other driver believed to be heavily injured. Is it a disaster? I give you 10 seconds to think about it. No, right? This is because I sustained a minor injury, and people always have injury incident. Even heavily injured, we might call it as a major accident. We didn't call it as disaster as yet, right? Okay, but this next statement will change everything. The other driver believed to be the Malaysia Prime Minister. Is it a disaster? Yes, right? Because now we involve the community leader, the country leader got involved in an accident with a commoner, and I might be charged for trying to kill the Prime Minister of Malaysia, and I'll already be in jail. But for the country, now they don't have a Prime Minister at the moment. The Prime Minister is heavily injured. So it's a disaster in a way, right? So the thing is, what I want to share with you, everyone see disaster differently. The big question here, are we prepared for any disaster to happen? So this is the definition of disaster that I like. It's from Turner and Pigeon. Not saying that I like, but it's more comprehensive and more understandable. Turner and Pigeon stated that disaster is an unusually large scale, costly, public, unexpected, or have some of the mentioned properties combined. So meaning to say here, Turner and Pigeon didn't give any fact or figures or numbers to define disaster. It depends on the country who want to implement it, how the country want to say that is disaster. For example, in Malaysia, if 1 or 2 people died from an accident or 10 people died from an accident, we call it as a major accident or disaster already. But in certain countries, 10 people die or 100 people die in a day is a normal thing. Why? Why people call it is normal thing? Because this country is at war, such as Iraq, Iran, or Afghanistan. This country is at war. 100 people die or 10 people die is a normal thing. But if 1,000 people die for them, then they decide that that is a disaster. It's different between a country itself. It's different in the community itself. So, basically, disasters are divided into 3 types of disaster. We have a natural disaster, which occurs naturally. It can be natural phenomenon beneath Earth's surface, like a geyser or an earthquake. Natural phenomenon at Earth's surface, it can be the crack due to the earthquake. Meteorological or hydrological phenomenon, like flood, or biological phenomenon, like what we are seeing right now, the outbreak of COVID-19, the pandemic outbreak. Second type of disaster is a man-made disaster. Man-made disasters are divided into 2 types, which is a socio-technical disaster, which is a technological disaster from industries or from technologies itself. Transportation disaster, accident, road traffic accident, public places failure. Normally, we look at something like pandemic hygiene outbreak or dengue or flash flood, due to reason that although it's a flood, the flash flood is different. It's caused by human error from designing a bad water catchment area. So it's a public places failure or a production failure itself. And the second type of man-made disaster is warfare. Either it's an international conflict or can be a national conflict itself. The third type of disaster is a hybrid disaster. Hybrid disaster started from natural disaster, and after the natural disaster hit the certain area, it caused a man-made disaster. That's why we call it as a hybrid disaster. So basically, incident, accident, disaster, crisis is an emergency situation. And man-made disaster is defined as man-made hazard and disaster arise from errors and human action. Natural disaster is a natural hazard arise from naturally and usually unpredictable event. And hybrid disaster, or some call it as NATAC, natural disaster which lead to technological disaster, is defined as a hybrid disaster. An example of hybrid disaster is Fukushima Daiichi disaster. Started from a Tohoku earthquake which caused a tsunami in 2011, and then suddenly the tsunami which from the Tohoku earthquake hit a nuclear power plant, causing equipment failures. This has caused 3 nuclear reactor meltdowns and release of radioactive material in 12 March 2011, and it's recorded as the largest nuclear disaster since Chernobyl. If you see here, it started from a natural disaster, but later on it evolved to a man-made disaster. So this is an example, a classic example of a hybrid disaster. The problem is not just the impact of the disaster. It is after the disaster event itself, the impact after the disaster event. It can be weeks, it can be years, it can be decades, the impact of the disaster. Thank you. This is the end of the second session. I'll see you in the next session. Bye.